Not only that, we've had instances where, and this is where the liability comes. For example, if you've got a sex offender in a condominium and the background screening company misses it, they give them a clean bill of health, and this has happened. The other thing that condo associations need to check is the application itself, check that person out, but they need to be more diligent and find out, what about a lady, this is an actual case we had. She moved in, she was a AAA person, but her boyfriend happened to be a convicted felon.
This episode brought to you by Suites at Madison. Meeting and conference rooms for rent by the hour, week, month, or year. Suites at Madison, where business gets done. Check them out at www.downtowntampaoffice.com. Now, on to the show.
You are listening to the Invest Florida Real Estate Show, covering topics in lending, buy and sell strategies, property management, hot markets, and tips and tools to guide you along the way on your path to real estate success. You want Florida investment real estate talk? You have come to the right place. And now, our hosts, Eric Odom and Steven Silverman.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Invest Florida Real Estate Show. This is your co-host, Eric Odom, along with Steven Silverman, entering the dog days of summer. It's typical Florida already, Steven. Feels like we've been having a hurricane, even though there's been no hurricanes. Lots of rain.
Lots of rain, and you know, I walk the dog, and I'm fine. I wear a raincoat. I take the umbrella for the dog, because who wants to bring home a wet dog?
Tasha's, she definitely is a wet animal when she goes out there, miserable animal when she comes back.
And she's a working girl, so to bring her into the office, I have to be kind to everybody else.
It's an interesting market. I mean, obviously, we're seeing interest rates are driving a lot of slowdown in the market. We're not going to zero by any stretch of the imagination, but we're definitely seeing a decrease in sales transactions, and it's pretty apparent. Steven, what are your thoughts about sort of where we are right now in the cycle?
Well, for sure, demand is so much higher than supply. You would think that in this environment that you'd start to see a little bit of supply shaking loose as loans mature and interest rates go up and people just want to move into other assets. But we haven't seen it, and probably we've got to go a way further before we start to see any of that. There's just a lot more demand than there is supply.
Right. I mean, the challenge, though, obviously, is that there's this gap here between cap rates and interest rates. Nobody's going to borrow at 7% and want to get a 5% cap. You've had negative leverage situation, and the seller's going to have to understand that, and we call it the come to Jesus period. If somebody has to sell and they have to get out, there's that period of time where the interest rates don't make sense for the cap, and eventually those prices have to come down, or the deals just don't transact. But I think what we're seeing is there's a lot more cash transactions still happening in the market, Steven.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but a lot of these loans, I mean, some of these low cap rates made sense when you could get a 3.5% mortgage and then do a 5%, 5.5% cap rate. It's not ideal, but you could maybe justify it. But now those same investors who couldn't get any return on the assets in the bank before can now put them in the money market and get 4%. And it doesn't make sense to buy something with a 5 or a 6% cap rate.
Right. In the meantime, we've got a great guest today, Stephen. We'll talk a little bit about the liability that you have as an owner, dealing with credit reports and dealing with background checks on potential tenants or on your investor partners. And there's some pretty strict laws, particularly on the consumer side, that could get you in a world of hurt. We're going to talk about that a little today.
Yeah, well, for us, this is not an academic discussion. I mean, we do property management, and we do go ahead and do background checks and credit checks. And who knows, if you don't do that right, everybody is in a heap of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not always the way you think. Also, it's kind of one of those things that people think, well, if your information is bad on the individual, you could get burned that way and end up in litigation you don't want to be in. But also, if you do background checks and it doesn't reveal everything that should have been revealed, you can also have liability there as well. So, I mean, this is a sort of a a tricky situation. It's like, almost the damned if you do and damned if you don't. But it's treacherous waters.
Well, there's also a sense of complacency because a lot of people recognize the importance and they think they're doing the right thing. They go ahead and they do a check, but it's not the right kind of check and it doesn't protect them.
Right. Before we get rolling with the guest, though, would like to thank iPhone Fiend. He leaves a review. We love reviews, Stephen. They help us to attract guests. We've tried to explain this to folks before. This show is hard to produce. It's a very time-consuming endeavor. This is not the intention of the show for us to make a revenue stream off of the podcast. It's sort of a labor of love. We enjoy having these conversations with guests, but it is hard to produce it. And because there is no revenue that's attached to it, we're committing resources and human resources to try to program the show. And we have to contact 5, 6, 7 people in order to get one person that is willing to come on and tell their story. And so one of the things that helps us are reviews. And when potential guests are looking whether they're going to invest their time with us or not, they'll look to see who's listening, what's the audience like, and what does the audience say about the show. And so when you guys leave reviews, it helps a lot. So I'm going to ask you, if you've not done that already, to please do so, because it is a help, not only for us, but it's a help for you because it helps us get quality guests. But iPhone Fiend leaves a review and he says, Invest Florida gets top marks. Eric and Stephen are an outstanding podcast duo. This show gets top marks and is in my regular podcast rotation. I'm a young Florida real estate investor and made my bones in tax deed auctions across the state. This show empowers you to be better at your craft. Each guest brings unique insight into the real estate market and related industries. I'm looking to expand out of Florida and have greatly appreciated the discussions with guests that are outside of the state. Thank you to the hosts and thank you to the guests. I cannot thank you enough for the quality content. iPhone Fiend, that's very, very nice. It's kind. We appreciate the time. We know that it takes time out of your day to leave this type of review, and it means a lot to us, and it means a lot to the show, so we really appreciate that time. Stephen, if folks want to leave a review, how do they do that?
So just go to the Apple or Google and leave reviews. And, it's amazing how people read them and share them. And when prospective guests see those reviews, they want to be on the show, and it helps us keep the quality high.
Absolutely. Guys, as always, we appreciate your time on the show. Appreciate you leaving these reviews. And we're going to go ahead, unless we've got some other housekeeping items, Steve, we're going to go ahead and roll into our guest.
Eric, I've always got housekeeping, but you don't want to do it. So let's get on with the show.
That's true.
Today we have with us Hank Balevic. Hank is a former FBI special agent and director of corporate security. Hank learned background screening the correct way by conducting extensive FBI investigations involving cabinet-level and judicial appointees. After his service with the FBI, he became aware of the unlawful applicant background screening procedures being used by many companies. As a result of incompetent procedures, reports that were generated based on bogus information, which resulted in applicants being denied employment and tenancy. Appalled by his observations, he founded Fidelity Data Service, a background screening company dedicated to scrupulous compliance with the law, a meticulous review of all criminal and background records. Hank is the author of Faulty Background Checks, Shatters Applicants' Lives While Harming Businesses. He is a member of the former Special Agents of the FBI and is a licensed Florida private investigator. Hank is a Navy veteran and holds a bachelor's degree in economics. Hank, welcome to the Invest Florida show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Hank, we really appreciate you investing time with us today. It's a very litigious society, and us as property managers, investors, and brokers, one of the things we have to do, because it's part of our responsibility, is to make sure that we're doing proper checks and whatnot. And so this is what you do. We're going to be covering this topic today, and we want to hear some of your experience because you've been doing this for a long time. You've been not just is it 35 years you've been doing background checks, or is that on top of the FBI? Why don't you give us a little bit of a background of how you got here?
In the total Yeah, the total would be the FBI experience, and then we've been doing background screening privately for about 14 years. And what we do is the screening for employment, tenant background screening, condos, HOAs, those type of organizations.
And you're also doing background checks for commercial real estate, maybe the syndicators or investor pools or that sort of thing too, right?
Correct. Yeah,
So,
a lot of them are investors purchasing office condos, and we have quite a few companies in South Florida that have us check the purchasers out. Obviously, it's important, especially a lot of these condos have very high quarterly dues and maintenance fees, so they want to scrutinize somebody and make sure that they can pay the bills.
So Hank, I will tell you that I did read your book, and I was surprised at what I didn't know. I always thought, well, you call up a company and they do a screening report and that's it, everything's there. And I was just surprised to learn in reading your book how often these reports are incorrect, and as an investor you can not qualify a tenant because of an incorrect report, and then from a tenant's perspective, they can be denied an occupancy or other things. So, I mean, how does that even happen? I mean, does everyone use some database somewhere where they don't look at the records properly? Or it seems to me that a lot of the people doing these reports just really aren't that qualified.
Yeah, I just have to say ditto to that. Here's the problem. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I've actually talked to attorneys that don't know what's in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. They feel that the Fair Credit Reporting Act that was passed in 1970 to regulate the Equifax and TransUnion, the credit bureaus. But I believe since that time, in 1970, they've had 28 additions or updates to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So now they regulate all background screening, and they mandate that you use accurate databases, and the most accurate data you're going to get is from the federal agencies. That's one database, and also the county civil and county criminal records. Mainly the bad, I call them bad, the background screening companies that violate the law, they are not getting accurate information from the civil and criminal records at the county level. That's what the problem is. They use stale databases. They use algorithms. They actually, one lawsuit that I read, that the attorneys found that this one company was keying on an applicant's middle name. They weren't interested in the full name. They weren't interested in the date of birth, social security number, residence. Stuff we do is a practical matter. Every search we do, we thoroughly check that person. And that's why there's so many errors. Not only that, we've had instances where, and this is where the liability comes, for example, if you've got a sex offender in a condominium and the background screening company misses it, they give them a clean bill of health, and this has happened. The other thing that condo associations need to check is the application itself, check that person out, but they need to be more diligent and find out, what about a lady, this is an actual case we had. She moved in, she was a AAA person, but her boyfriend happened to be a convicted felon. He served years in a penitentiary, and guess what? He was a sex offender. They had no clue. Well, it seemed that he was exposing himself out in the parking lot to, happened with a child, I would say it was about 14, 15-year-old girl. We got involved. They had us get involved. I'm also a private investigator. Come to find out that this guy was really pretty bad. So anyway, we took action, or they took action, and they got him out of the condo. And they went back and scrutinized all the applicants that were renting, and to make sure that they didn't have somebody in there, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, with a criminal record.
Yeah, this is a nightmare for all apartments or not even single family. I was going to say a residential, but it's also commercial too, that who's ever going to be occupying and either living or doing business out of that space that is properly vetted, because if not, as a landlord, you can have liability there. And I'm sure you can probably tell us cases about that type of thing where they missed and all of a sudden you end up in a lawsuit over, wow, you really should have screened this and you didn't do the job you're supposed to do.
Well, there's one case I can point to, and that's Home Depot. And Home Depot does a lot of background screening, but they missed their company they used, and I don't think I should use the name of the company that they use, but the company they do use is pretty notorious. They've been sued about 340 times for violations of the Fair Credit Act, not only by private attorneys, but also by the Federal Trade Commission. They missed a guy that raped his girlfriend, slashed her, spent 7 years in prison, and they missed this. And it was only when two neighbors went to that Home Depot and they needed to get some paint. And they recognized the guy working in the paint as guy that was the convicted felon, spent all his time. And they brought it to the attention of Home Depot, and certainly they got rid of the guy. But there's no telling how many bad folks, criminals, that they miss, a lot of these background screening companies. And I might add that over 100 have been sued for faulty background checks. And that's basically why I wrote the book. I got involved and I just found so many of these companies just miss everything.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes both ways, right? Like you can miss and something happens on your property that you missed and the credit report is bad. But also on the other side, there are situations where you're using data that's not accurate to turn somebody down and you get sued that way too. So it's like the faulty data can cut that blade can cut both ways, right?
Correct.
So just taking that a step further, I mean, we're talking about all the criminal aspects and things that people have done, but in the commercial real estate business here, we're also looking to see other databases. Have they not paid rent? Have they been delinquent? Have they been evicted? Is their credit score decent? How accurate are those databases, and how can we improve the reliability of that aspect of it?
Yeah, that's tough on commercial because it's buried inside of a corporation.
Yeah, the best search you can do is a county civil search. And when this is going back to my FBI days, and it's what we do every day in background screening, if we want to check somebody for liens, judgments, foreclosures, credit report is okay. But it's better you go to the county civil and do it in every place that applicant has ever lived or worked. Now you're going to find out the true story. So now you're going to find out what type of activity they've had. When we've done background screening for corporations that want to move in on a condo, office condo, for example, I'm going to say about 25% of the time we get information on the applicant. Either they sued somebody or they've been sued in connection with an occupancy. So it's one of the searches that I recommend highly. The other search is federal. Everybody thinks, well, you're going to do a nationwide background check and you go into a database. And a lot of these databases are stale. That is to say, they go in to the county records, they check it, they put that in their database, and they never update it for 60, 90 days, or maybe even longer. The other thing is the general population doesn't realize we have two criminal justice systems. One is the local, state, and then there's federal. And there's some overlap, but most of the federal cases are interstate. ITAR is one, interstate transportation in aid of racketeering. You've got involving arson, exorbitant credit transactions. You've got all of that stuff. You've got bank robberies, which are both a local violation, which would be an armed robbery or a strong arm robbery. Also, it's a federal offense. kidnapping, and you've got a host of federal crimes that nobody checks. When we go in and check, we oftentimes, I'm not going to say it's not as prevalent as the local stuff because you're looking at assaults and in common law robbery and thieving and stuff. The federal are more serious, and we just don't get as many, but they're serious. They're serious and they're prevalent.
So I have a question on those databases, like you mentioned the county here, because we live in a litigious society, and people sue and they sue, like for whatever reason, they're not always successful. So when you pick up something at the county level or the federal level, is it that they sued and were found guilty, or just that they were sued because maybe they weren't, maybe it was frivolous, maybe the person who sued them lost or whatever?
Yeah, we always go for a disposition. That's very, very important. As you said, it's litigious. So maybe it's just they had a chip on their shoulder and they sued them. They didn't like the guy. So we go and look for, well, was it dismissed? Was an adjudication withheld in as far as a criminal offense goes? But we look at the whole record, and that's what we report on. And there are some restrictions on, even if it was, let's say, a civil case, there's a 7-year limit on what can be reported. For example, evictions. If the person was evicted, you have 7 years. You can't go back farther than 7 years. So again, you've got to be careful that you don't violate the federal law, which is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So you've got to deal with a company that knows what they're doing.
Talk to us a little bit about the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I want to ask you that question first, and then I also want to kind of talk about what I think most apartment owners or landlords or managers are using these sort of inexpensive methods of doing background checks. So if you could hit the Fair Credit first, we can talk a little bit about that, like some of the pitfalls people might want to be concerned about. And then the next question would be about these, like TransUnion has like a $29 background check. And I think that probably is referring back to some of the stuff you did before. A lot of the information is not accurate.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I see oftentimes with a lot of companies, they do an instant background check, an instant criminal check. That is against the law. That's against the Fair Credit Reporting Act because they say you've got to review the data. So we do an instant background check, supposing now the case was dismissed, maybe adjudication withheld, maybe it was went to trial and it was not guilty, and they're reporting that. That's a violation. So that's the thing that you've got to watch out for. Instant background checks are, in capital letters, they're illegal. You can't use them, and you shouldn't use them, and a lot of companies do. And just like going to the record, the county records, they're not doing that. They're going to a stale database, and they're reporting whatever is there. I had a case involving, well, I actually talked to the attorney. He was upset because his client was denied a job, and he said he was arrested, convicted, and it was expunged. But there it was, right in the record. Why? Because it was a stale database. They never updated it. So that's something to watch out for.
And so when that happens, the person who was discriminated against with that data has legal recourse?
Yes. They would. Yeah. They could bring a lawsuit because of it, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's a lot of, like I said, there are thousands of lawsuits filed all the time. The other thing is the Federal Trade Commission gets involved in a lot of these cases. And I've got one here. This was Appfolio. They're a tenant screening outfit. They were sued by the Federal Trade Commission. Yeah. And they wound up paying for $4.25 million for.
Wow! So Appfolio, that's like probably the largest, or one of the largest, if not the largest, residential property management software packages. So they got hit with a pretty big, hefty fine.
Yeah.
And what did they get hit for, Hank?
$4.25 million.
And what was the violation?
For failing to follow accuracy requirements for screening reports. Just what we've been talking about.
Yeah. Ouch.
They weren't diligent in getting accurate information. And that's what the Fair Credit Reporting Act says, that you shall use reasonable procedures to assure maximum accuracy. That's a direct quote from the from the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act. They're not doing that. And you got to be careful.
Okay, so it's tough because all, let's say, apartment landlords or managers or whatever, they have there's competition, and application fees are $50 or whatever, and that's kind of standard. They can't come in and say, "Well, I'm going to charge $150 and do this like in-depth background check." So, what do you? And of course, they manage 350 units, and every day they're doing 5, 6, 7 background checks. So there's a practicality aspect here too. So what would you tell them? What would you suggest to them on how they properly handle their screenings?
I know in our area, they're allowed $150 for an application fee. So we have the luxury of charging $45 or $50 so that we can do a complete check. We do the nationwide sex offender, OFAC, which is Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's the terrorist watch list. And by the way, we've had a couple on that list, so you never know. And we also do a residence check. And that we're getting from a credit bureau header. We don't have to do the credit report itself, but the database that we get this from does that. So now we can find if somebody is hide and go seek. They had a problem in Baltimore County, say, but they don't list that on the application. So that's what we check. So we check all of that business, and then we go to the county, and that's a pretty thorough search. Now, if you want to kick it up and check federal, but generally, the things that involve tenants usually are at the county level, county courthouse, and we charge $10, which is pretty cheap.
$10 per county?
Yeah.
$10 per
so
county, okay.
That's not going to bust anybody's budget.
And what is the typical time it takes to get a background report?
Okay. Generally, we get it back the same day because the county level searches, about 75% are electronic. So we can go electronically and get those records instantaneously, and now we put together our report, so you're going to have it the same day. Sometimes, if they're not electronic, then we'd have to send somebody to the courthouse, and that's going to take 2 days, 3 days to get that report back. So most of our reports come back rather quickly, a day or two.
And so from the real estate point of view, the background check is one really important element. And I was so surprised reading the book to find out all the errors. Do you come across similar kind of errors on credit reporting? And if so, are there any steps to try and mitigate that? Because, as landlords, who wants to lose tenants because of poor reports, be it background or credit?
What I tell condominium associations is, don't get hung up on that credit report number. So you might want a 580, but supposing, and I've seen thousands of credit reports, both when with the Bureau and industry. What happens is, on a lot of the reports, there's an expression, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Once erroneous information gets in that credit report, it's going to stay there forever and ever. So I preach, instead of looking at that number, the credit score, as it's called, look at the trade. Do they pay their bills on time? I have seen where somebody, an investor, we're talking about investors now, they have duplexes and triplexes, and they've got all this rental property, and it's all financed. What happens is they get a big hit on their credit score because they've got all this outstanding debt. Do they pay their bills on time? Absolutely. They're AAA people. But the score is lower. It might be 580, it might be 600, who knows? Not great. It's not up in the 700-800 range. So I say, if you're going to look at them, look at the trade references. They maybe have 5, 6, 8, 10. Are they paying their mortgages on time? If they are, they're probably going to be a good risk.
And are you able to handle that end of it too, or do you just concentrate on the background reports?
No, we do credit, and as I said, yeah, we do a lot of credit reports, but we scrutinize those too. They used to have criminal information in there. They've gotten away from that because, again, we get the sloppiness business. You'll get some reports that have erroneous information. They report it. They wind up getting sued. I mean, they've paid hundreds of millions of dollars. TransUnion, Equifax, Experian, they've all paid tons of money. So they've gotten really tightened up on what they report. So, but still, there's a lot of erroneous information put in there. And once it gets in, it stays in. So the thing to do is look at that credit report, get into county, liens, judgments, foreclosures, and then you get a good picture.
Hank, talk to us about pricing. So let's just, again, because our listener base is mostly apartment owners. So they're, I don't want to say mostly, there's a lot of them. It's probably the majority, 50 to 60% of them are owning multifamily property. So we use them as an example. It could apply really to anybody. But what is the pricing going to look like? And then what package would you recommend with a pricing for your standard apartment dweller, somebody coming and wanting to rent an apartment from one of the owners?
Okay, we charge on the basic package, which is, and I mentioned sex offender, nationwide, OFAC, the residence history. We charge $28 for that. Then add another 10 or 12. Sometimes we have to charge a little more on these counties, especially if somebody goes out there and that'd be 10 or 12 bucks. So you're talking about $38, $40 is a decent search. If, for example, you wanted to check the federal record, that's another 10 bucks. So 40, 50 bucks, and it's a decent search.
And in your experience, how do landlords typically handle this? Do they pass it on to the tenant, or is it something that they undertake?
I see most of them make an application fee for the applicant, and it's built into the fee. If it's a private landlord, the condos, they're restricted by Florida law. I believe it's 150 is the maximum, but some associations it's lower. So it's a cost that could be passed on to the applicant.
Yeah, because I've seen it the other way, where the applicant just gets a website. They've got to go onto the website, give their credit card, and they pay the fees. It actually does not filter down to property management when we're leasing a property. And frankly, all that personal and confidential information doesn't come through the property management firm. It stays with the investigating firm.
That's correct. As we're talking about it, this is one thing that's very, very important. That is the authorization form itself. You've got to get proper authorization from the applicant. Two pieces of paper that are required. Number one is the disclosure on the part of the background screening company or the condo association or the investor to let them know they're going to have a background check done. They sign off on that. And then the authorization form itself. In my seminars, I point this out. This is an example of, it's called a hold harmless agreement. It's a liability waiver. And I think these lawyers, when they go to law school, that's the first thing they learn how to do, is to protect their client. If they're going to have a contract, they usually have what's called a hold harmless agreement that simply says that they're not going to be responsible for any mistakes they make. Now, one of these cases, this is a big one. It's against Publix. Publix was sued because they had a hold harmless agreement in their authorization form. And that's a big outfit. They've got a legal department, and yet they had it. So anyway, they wound up getting sued for having this illegal authorization form, and they wound up paying, $6.8 million. It cost them to have that form. So guess what? Now they don't have the form anymore. But there are many, many forms like that out there. I see them every day. And that's the first thing I'll say to a condo association, HOA, employer, whatever, is you've got to have a legal authorization form. If you have a hold harmless agreement, you're looking for trouble. And one of the things that plaintiffs' attorneys do, and the FTC will do the same thing, once they file that lawsuit, they get discovery. They get to get all that information from the defendant, like Publix. In Publix, this turned out to be a class action lawsuit. And what did they have? They had a couple 100,000 plaintiffs involved in that. And that's why it was a $6.8 million case. So the lawyers get involved. Once they get discovery, they check out all the applications, all their paperwork, and lo and behold, now it's not a onesie, twosie lawsuit. They come in and, wow, we've got 50, 100. We had one, this is one I always get to when I mention it to seminars, that it affects millions of applicants. Some of these class action lawsuits, 440,000 members, 660,000. It's incredible. So you got to be careful.
Lot to talk about there, man. I mean, there's a lot of meat on that bone. I mean, just it's so concerning from from an investor, from a broker, and how that knife cuts both ways. You can get sued if you're overly aggressive. You can get sued if you don't check the boxes and somebody gets through. There's just a lot of potential issues there, Stephen. Is there anything? Go ahead, Stephen.
No, and just following on what you said, what was scary to me is, we all think we're doing the right thing, but if you're not using the right databases and the information you're getting, you're trying to do the right thing. But if you're not getting the right database, it's exposure for ourselves, for our clients, for everybody.
Yep.
What do they call that? That negligent hiring, negligent tenancy, whatever. They've got all these buzzwords for all the legal stuff that they can be sued for. So, you got to be careful.
Yeah. So, Hank, if people want to learn more about this or contact you directly, what's the best way they can reach you?
Well, our website is fidelitydataservice.com, and that's got everything in there. And of course, the book, Faulty Background Checks, that's the second edition. The first edition was Corporate Greed, and it was a little ambiguous. So now it's Faulty Background Checks. And it's about a 400-page book. And what I do is I go through, if you've read it, I give major corporation lawsuits and the screening companies, who they are, who got sued. And I've always been a fan of cases. And I've been to a lot of seminars put on by attorneys, and they all preach, the whys and wherefores of the legislation. In my book, what I did was I reported on what happened to the XYZ screening company. What happened to, for example, Home Depot when they used the company and then they hired a guy that was a sex offender. So those are the things that I did in my book, and it's Faulty Background Checks. And if anybody wants to check that out, I guess the best way is just to go to our website, or you could give me a call. My phone number is 561-371-3324, and I can get you a book right away.
All right. Well, Hank, thank you. That was awesome. I mean, this is a dimension of real estate investing that we don't think about enough. And we certainly learned some things, and I'm sure everybody else did also.
Okay. Well, very good. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Hank, really appreciate your time today, sir. And that was Hank Balevic from Fidelity Data Services. Good stuff, Stephen. The data side of this is important. The background check is important. It's critical to your property that it's being handled properly, but also so we don't get ourselves into hot water. What were your thoughts about Hank's comments?
So what was important from Hank is that, I realized that, you can feel good because you go tonight and brush your teeth, but are you brushing your teeth correctly? People are going out and they recognize that it's important to do it, but if they're not doing the right kind of search, it's not going to be helpful in any way and can just lead to problems.
No question about it. And the problems could end up in legal hot water. Nobody wants to spend their time and money on litigation. It's not what we got into this business for. So interesting comments, some interesting stuff from a guy who has a lot of experience in background screenings, a former FBI agent. Those are the type of guests we love. Besides Hank, if folks want to hear other great guests, where can they find that information, Stephen?
A test, and I know the answer. You go to our website, www.investfloridashow.com, and also go to the App Store. Download the app so you can listen to the show while you're mobile.
Guys, as always, we appreciate the time that you invest with us each and every episode. And until next time, hasta la vista.
You've just listened to the Invest Florida podcast with Eric Odom and Steven Silverman. Join us every week for actionable real estate investment ideas, and of course, visit our website at www.investfloridashow.com for more shows and tips on how to earn a cash flow in the real estate market in Florida. While hosts and producers of the Invest Florida show have no reason to doubt the validity of comments of our guests, we do not warranty their accuracy. Please check with your legal, financial, and tax advisors before entering into any investment. Returns will vary from person to person and deal to deal based on unique circumstances. All information expressed in this show is for educational purposes only. Opinions of the guests are not necessarily shared by the hosts and producers of the Invest Florida show.